Hi, everyone, and hi, Alexei. Um, I'm Vitaly. I'm a developer advocate at Case, and I'm passionate about quality. I believe that our world deserves products of high quality that than we're used to see on the market. And this is Alexei. With Alexei, we've been friends for ages, and we've been discussing quality assurance for such a long period of time that we decided to make it public. Alexei, tell us who you are.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Really glad to see you, my friend. I'm Alexei. My background is working in lots of big tech companies and obviously advising and all of that stuff, investing a little bit. So, for example, I worked in Google on Google Payments and in Yandex on web search. And a lot of cool stuff done here. And also, right now, I'm doing my own business, my own startup, which is AI cosmetic basically AI cosmetologist, which provides you a lot of insights on your skin quality based on your photos. So a lot of computer vision inside, obviously, a lot of Gen AI and conventional ML as well. So in my mind, it's all covered by these large topics of products which are based on data, on machine learning, and all that kind of stuff, and also a lot of research. And those are areas where sort of very traditional approaches to testing sometimes fail short because they are not super well, designed for that. So over the years, I had some experience, with testing a lot of products, obviously, together with my friends and all of that. So yeah, I think it's a good idea to share some of that because I believe that many of these approaches are also very useful in other scenarios, obviously. So yeah, would be
Yeah,
really interesting,
thanks.
I think.
And I do appreciate your products. It's like the proper use case for AI. I love it.
Yeah, in my mind as well. Yeah, that's exact. And also for technologies, again, I would say that in my career, I would say that. My feeling was that when you work on stuff like web search at some point it's not as satisfying as before because obviously it works just well already, so you do a lot of great releases but nobody cares too much, so you think, okay, can I do something for the real world? And yeah, this is obviously one of these cases when I think it's very, very useful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I truly believe that when we as developers or testers have some tangible results, something we can touch, or maybe see the users being really happy or angry with our products, then it makes more sense for us to work on something.
Yeah, it's very satisfying. Yeah, yeah.
So tell us about the testing efforts you have.
Yeah, so I prepared a number of examples here, three to be precise, which I consider like very useful in many cases. And let's start with the first one. So here I combined actually two approaches which are very, very similar. So what we're talking here is basically crowdsourced evaluation, and recently we also have an option to, make it a little bit more generic with AI agents. So what usually happens when you have, for example, in-house testing team, going through like functional testing and whatnot. One thing is that we struggle a lot with variety of environments. So, for example, in web search, it was like, you have iOS, Android, you have, desktops and whatnot. Then you have a lot of OS versions, and then you have a lot of browsers and all of that. So, when you multiply all of that, you get like thousands of environments, and obviously you can't really cover all of that pretty well. So that's one part. And the other part is that you really need some sort of research testing. So basically, with test cases, it's usually the case that you would say, we need them to be very precise, very functional, very sort of straightforward, so they are reproducible. But then you kind of lost a lot of stuff that could happen when you go outside of these scenarios, right?
Mhm.
So in my mind, what I call here crowdsourced testing covers that pretty much really, really well.
Mhm.
But also with regards to, these sort of research projects, there's more challenges to it. So for example, think of a product like, like ChatGPT, right? So you can talk about basically anything. So how do you test that, right? And also the results are always different. So, if you
Yeah.
tell hello one day to tell answer one thing and the other different thing. So it's really, really hard to test, really, really hard to tell when, something is wrong, really. So yeah.
I remember
The,
when I worked for Badoo, the dating app, we had a laboratory, a testing laboratory with mobile devices. so that
Yeah,
we
yeah, yeah.
could somehow replicate the diversity of environments that users have in our lab. And it was always a torture. Of course, we solved this problem, but it was always a torture. We had to add more and more phones, more and more emulators, more and more browsers to the phones. Then browser stack launched. So there are even products which are trying to satisfy these requirements for us testers.
Yeah, and also in my experience, also it was always a struggle with sort of geographical distribution, right? So for example,
Mm-hmm.
when you have your devices in your office, then probably you have Wi-Fi and probably your servers are at least somewhat close. But then, for
Mm-hmm.
example, in our case, we have users from, let's say, Australia or Africa, right? And the servers are in US or in Europe or something like that. And you don't. So one example that I had is, one time we launched this how do you call this, like one balancer thing for a certain service.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the
Geographical
idea,
balancing.
yeah, yeah, and basically the idea was that we have a number of services and they had different basically
Mm-hmm.
balancers. So you need to have this, SSL shakes and everything like that. And when everything is localized, it's not really a problem. But when we have the user from, literally the other end of the world,
Mm-hmm.
they were spending like 1 to 2 seconds for each of these handshakes, and we had like 10. So basically, the
Mm-hmm.
service was not really, useful for them at all. They just weren't able to use that, and you really can't get this kind of experience, when you have this sort of limited environment. Yeah. So crowdsourcing is one way to approach it. Basically, you have a crowdsourcing platform, and I will give you a few examples later on. And you have a number of sort of scenarios that they need to follow. Usually, in our case, they record the video. So, for example, we're testing the iOS app, right? So they turn on the screen recording, and then they share this video with us, and then we check this video whether we have some problems or not. So this way we can, approach a lot of users, obviously like hundreds, thousands if you want, and
Yeah.
they are very geographically distributed. So you have this in mind. Also, a very nice thing about that was that on average they have sort of like weaker devices, lower versions and all of that stuff. So you have additional checks on how you perform there, where your
Mm-hmm.
sort of limits in terms of, they needing,
Mm-hmm.
better sort of performance and so on. So uh, yeah, let me show you something about that.
And can I ask you a
Um,
question? With this
yeah, absolutely.
crowdsourcing, there was a way for you to enhance the variety of users socio-geographically, right? So
Yeah,
you could say, I want to have 10% from the other part of the world, let's say.
yeah. This is obviously usually they provide this option.
Mm-hmm.
Also, for example, they usually provide some, like filters on language that the users know and stuff like that. And also obviously for the platform. So for example, I can say, yeah, we launched this on iOS and this on Android, or basically doesn't really matter. One thing that really impressed me is that you don't really need to work too much on the exact scenarios because
Mm-hmm.
naturally they will just do different things, and that was really really exciting for me. And we found a lot of bugs because of that, like just a
So
ton. Because
it's like a free exploratory testing of some sort.
yeah, exactly, even if your scenario is very very straightforward, still they would do a lot of different stuff. And one really nice example for me was that the first time I launched this test for our Lovia app, basically that was the first time that someone decided to turn the phone into landscape mode. Yeah, and nobody never ever tried to do that. For example, on my phone it's completely locked because I hate it. So no way to do this. And the second funny story that I told you that this enables for testing on relatively slower older
Mm-hmm.
devices. But then, so basically, when we do this, I feel like, yeah, now that works. If it works on slow devices, on older versions, I'm covered. But then at some point, we had a bug where basically it crashed on the very new version of iPhone because the resolution was so high that, there was some overflow or whatever. And funnily enough, that was on an investor's phone. So
Okay.
so there is that as
Nice.
well. So for different cases, you really need, these different modalities.
So your investor was faster at getting a new iPhone than you were.
Yeah. Obviously, again, I was always testing, on a sort of like middle of the road kind of phone, just to be with my users. So
Hmm.
nobody really tried to test on your, like the latest version because usually we don't have a lot of those. So, for
Hmm.
example, here you can see uh, a very old description, probably one of the first that we created, like maybe the first one, maybe like the third or whatever. So you don't really need to put too much effort into it. Like you can say, all right, install the application from test flight, like
Hmm.
get the onboarding going. In our case, it was also about, taking a picture of your face. So, you have this little green thing here. And then, just do this, do that, and then upload the video. And then depending of what you need, for example, here we were testing the payment stuff as well. So we had this, testing credentials for emails, for passwords, and all of that sort. And basically after that, they would just upload the video and we have the results basically.
Hmm.
So again, many people sort of struggle with this approach because they think that they need to spend, too much time thinking about the scenario. While in reality, you don't really need to do so. You just, just it can be really, really straightforward, like here, for example.
But what happens if the testers, crowdsource testers, can't reproduce the scenario? So maybe you didn't define it well, or
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, nothing really bad about that. Again, here, for example, we had, again, something like middle of the road scenario. So something that you start, you install the app, you go through onboarding, you do a few scenarios, and you just end. So it's basically you can consider it like a smoke test of sorts, right?
hmm.
So just basic usage without like prolonged usage and history and stuff like that. But then they will still deviate from this scenario a little bit, and then you just test more things. So for us, in this case, it was mostly about catching crashes, to be honest, and maybe some dysfunctions of the interface. And
Mm.
that was, pretty much enough when we have a certain video that people are just, doing something within the scope.
So
So
it's
that
like
was,
a happy path testing done on all the possible platforms and resolutions and OSs, etc.
yeah, exactly,
Nice.
exactly. I would say that, if you have something very, very specific in mind, this could also work, obviously. In which case, I would definitely advise to make it kind of shorter,
Hmm.
because here we just wanted to have sort of an, end-to-end test where you install the app and you get the results at the end of it, which is, obviously a little bit tough to
Hmm.
execute specifically. But yeah, you can definitely do that. And also, what they usually provide is an option to sort of apply some filters. So, for example, I can have user who already installed the app,
Hmm.
so I can launch a very specific test only on them. So
Hmm.
then, they don't need to go through all of the steps, and it's much, much easier for them.
Nice.
Uh, yeah, so in our case, and this basically is what I, usually do.
Hmm.
So one task is basically going through a scenario. Usually, again, a little bit not too complex. Again, in our cases, it was like even with this happy path, they were spending like 20, sometimes 30 minutes on it, simply because it's yeah, for them it's a little bit complex because they need to install the app to go through all the steps and then return to the scenario and see what I need to do next. So, a lot of switches. So it's a little bit hard and obviously don't want to, make people struggle a lot here. So it's much, much better when they can finish in like 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It's much better for them. And you don't need to pay as much,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah,
And then
because
the second,
with this crowdsourcing, you're paying for their time, right? Like
yeah,
hourly
basically that.
rate.
So for example, if you tell them that the task takes, let's say, 10 minutes, and they think, all right, I'm getting like this amount of money and 10 minutes, that sounds fair. But when the task really, takes like 40 minutes, they are not super happy, and this is not the right thing to do as well. So,
Hmm.
so yeah, it makes sense to, look for complexity here. And then the second task is basically to check the recorded videos. It's also very natural step. I would say almost always when you do something crowdsourced based, you also need to check the results because in many cases that would be even just like a fraud, right? So for example, they would upload an image or a video of something completely different. That happens a lot of time.
Yeah. So they're
Uh,
not on your team, so you can't trust them as they would as you would do your with your testers.
Yeah, basically, I would say that this is like a really, really sort of high fraudulent sort of environment. So you need to treat it, as it is. So a few tricks to kind of work around that. One is honeypots, what we call. It's basically the task where we know the answer. So one way to approach that is, for example, for tasks of the first group, right? If you uploaded not a video, or you uploaded a video which is like 10 seconds long, you can definitely just deny it like right away.
Mhm,
And for task number two, basically we had like, the videos with crashes, videos with different kinds of bugs, and then they needed to check the checkboxes like we have the crash here, we have something else here going on, and then we just see whether people are actually checking that. So if you know the answer and if they not really, following this answer, then probably something is wrong with that and we can ban them or something like that. Also, really important thing is post factum payments. So we only pay for the tasks that we sort of approve of, right?
mhm,
So if the
mhm,
scenario was complete, if the video was, good enough, if they performed all the honey task properly, then we pay. That really reduces the, the load like really, really much.
mhm,
And in our case, each sort of, occurrence of this type of testing was like $10, sometimes a little bit more because we wanted to go like deeper, and just cover more bases. Usually it was like 2 hours, maybe sometimes three, sometimes one, again, depending on, on the scope. And usually we were able to approach like 200 to 300 of users. Again, you can, go higher, go lower,
mhm. That's
depending on
very
the scenario.
cheap. That's quite cheap.
Yeah, that's basically it. Yeah. And to be honest, for me, it's always sort of the first layer of testing that we have, like in
Mm,
any project. Yeah,
mhm,
because this is end to end, right? There's a lot of environments again. So if it performs well here, you can sort of imagine that probably it's not so bad.
mhm.
Uh, yeah,
And
and
also this diversity, as far as I understand, this variety of users trying out your app or your changes, this means that this variety is so high, or you can make it so high, so that even a complex shell testing scenario can work here. Like you
yeah,
have,
absolutely, absolutely, yeah, yeah.
so
Then
you,
again,
you can you can you can use it even to test ChatGPT, but make it a million users.
yeah, absolutely. I would say that that's basically what they do, right? They just launch the product, and then a lot of people try it, so they have all kinds of bugs, and then just they sort of fix them. That's also an approach, and you can think that launching in the production is also a way of sort of a crowdsourcing testing, right? You just don't have the artifacts like videos and stuff. A few funny charts. So, for example, this is our daily audience some years ago. As you can imagine, blue here is US, and then everything else is other countries. So you can sort of imagine at which days did we have this sort of testing, right? So again, this is very, very cool because other than that, we didn't really have an option to go, in these countries and check how it worked there, and what happens and whatnot. And again, a few kind of funny things. Again, this is like the first launches ever, so we had like this dark mode for the app, and the web onboarding was also a little bit cringe. So anyway, all kinds of stuff. Like for example, the as you can see here, like website is a little bit out of shape, or we have a lot of errors of certain type. Also, yeah, really, really important, kind of failure mode here was that we just don't work with smaller sort of screens because everybody, everything was sort of built for certain again screen. I think this is something like iPhone like 11 or mini, or how do they call it, like iPhone S or whatever. So anyway, a little bit less sort of rectangular screen, so nothing really fits. And that was super, super fun because, you don't really have any other options to do this. So that was really nice. And then basically agents came into play, right?
Right.
So now you can say, all right, we can launch this on, humans and they would do this, but you can also launch this, on agents and they would probably also do this. So for now, right now, for us, the setup is that we have device form on AWS.
Mhm.
Um, in my mind, for example, like Google Cloud is also pretty much fine here, but they are mostly concerned about Android, obviously. So, if you want
Right.
iOS, probably this is a little bit more useful. So then what you can do is you basically can have an app. You can inject it into a number of devices. So for example, here we have like 5 devices, and then you have something like that. You can look in process like how it works on the
Nice.
screen. Yeah, so the magic here is that for each sort of screen, for each app state, you have this sort of understanding of what is the setup here. So on the right, you have that like JSON representation of all this sort of elements that you have on the screen,
Mhm.
and you can basically tell your LLM or like LMM, like here is the screen, here are the elements, what do you really need to input, what do you really need to push, and that basically creates again a lot of this various scenario that the agent sort of go through your app, does different thing. You can also upload certain artifacts here. So for example, in our case, we need to upload, let's say, an image of a product, so they can launch the product scanner on a certain image because they, obviously they don't have, anything around that. But anyway, it works pretty well.
So instead
And
of
again,
a real device, you have an agent, LLM agent, which works as if it is a device, right? You tell
it
them,
works as it is a user while
all
you
right,
really have a real device. Yeah, so
aha,
device farm basically provides you with real devices, real iPhones.
okay,
I can imagine these are not really these are not even emulator. These are like
mm-hmm,
legit devices.
okay,
Yeah, I think they have in just one location still. So, in
mm-hmm,
this regard, it's a little bit, limited, but still, you can launch a lot of them. So, like, I think my largest launch was like 50
mm-hmm,
devices. I don't do it on larger scale simply because you need to pay for them. So, you don't really,
okay,
yeah, you don't really need to go to scale here if you don't really need to, right?
right,
And yeah, so we populate a lot of these sort of, videos. Again, they provide the videos back to you.
mm-hmm,
So then you can look for, like bugs, long answers of the backend and stuff like that. What we also do on top of that, both for agents and crowdsourcing, one very important thing is that their artifact is a video, right? So in many cases, the video is just really, really huge, like
right,
you have iPhone Max version, like whatever, the current version is. So you have like 20 minutes of video and it's like 5 GB or
gigabytes, yeah,
whatever. Yeah, and it's really not fun to process. So what we did here is we created a service for shortening the videos, basically.
wow.
Yeah,
What is shortening? Cutting
yeah,
it or?
yeah. So what we do, so one thing is that we just downscale it from
Mm-hmm.
whatever the original, resolution is. Usually it's way too high for anything that we
Yeah.
do. Yeah, and the second part is just to remove the duplicate, shots. So, for example, when you are looking at the interface and you're thinking like, what do I need to do here, right? It might take some time, like
Yeah.
10 seconds, and then you have like 100 of these 10 seconds, and
All
then it's just,
right. So you're making a diff of videos, a set of diffs rather than a video, a
yeah,
set of
yeah,
screenshots.
exactly. Yeah, you can see here, right? So on the right, you have the shortened version of the same scenario
Mm-hmm.
as on the left.
Uh-huh.
So I actually recorded this like today on my device, and I was like just looking around and all of that. So for example, in my case, the resolution is like here,
This one, yeah.
it,
Mm-hmm.
it took like 50 seconds for me, and it was like 75 megabytes again.
Right.
Well,
Oh
good
my gosh.
quality. Yeah, and here you have a WebM,
Mm-hmm.
like 200 kilobytes, right? So.
Yeah. So you stripped all the unnecessary part which the robot or the real human would not need to watch.
Yeah, again, if this in this case, for example, you have a crash, right? So you will still see the crash.
Yeah.
If you have longer response time from your backend, you won't see that. So for some types of
Yeah.
analysis, you don't really need to do this. But for us, the case was that you upload these videos and then crowdsourcers look at that, and they cannot really download that. It's just too hard. They need to spend like 20 minutes looking at it,
Mhm.
just too hard. Yeah. So we just did this, and yeah, I really like the results. Again, we can say that here, for example, the quality of the video is not super high, but again, probably you don't really care about this too
That's
much.
enough. Yeah.
yeah, to make conclusions, that's probably just
Mm-hmm.
enough. But then again, you can play with this because obviously, you don't really, you know, need this like 200 kilobytes, right? You can probably
Yeah.
go to like 1 megabyte, 10 megabytes, probably that also would be fine. Yeah, and then again, the last step here is analysis. So, again, with crowdsourcing, we were relying on the humans to watch the videos and, draw something from it, some
Mm-hmm.
conclusions. Here we can actually do, again, this is a very, very simple example. So we had like early stage of our localization going on, and I just wanted to see like what kinds of problems do we have in these scenarios. And this is again a setup which basically everybody could do. I just go to Google Cloud to my like installation of Gemini, and I upload this video and say, yeah, please tell me whatever whatever problems you can see
Wow.
here. Yeah, even
Okay.
even without really specifying what is the problem, everything
Wow.
like that. Yeah, it gives me like per second distribution, like what is happening, which translations are not so good,
Okay, this is a proper replacement of a boring work of human beings with AI.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you can see here, for example, it captured
Yeah.
that we had a loading issue here.
Nice,
Uh,
nice. And
this
here
part,
you don't,
right?
and here you don't even care if it hallucinates, right? I mean, you would still review the outcomes of the LLM.
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, we have like,
Hmm.
50, like 100 of these videos. We make these sort of, descriptions of what's wrong, what's right, and then we can summarize it and basically have the breakdown of like what we should look at. And also with
Nice.
examples because we know each video from which, certain conclusion was drawn. So that's
Mm-hmm.
also very, very cool.
Mm-hmm.
Also,
Wow.
when yeah, if we return to device farm again, basically you know everything about the device, like what is the version of iOS was, what was the
So you can connect it all.
model, yeah, so you can basically
So,
reproduce it if you want.
so if your LLM at the very, so basically this is how I understand this works. So you have your IPA, your app. You deploy it to AWS device farm to let's say 50 devices there. Then devices record videos of how they use the app. Then those videos are fed into LLM, and LLM can outline what's happening there and can even advise what the issues might potentially be. And so as you have everything in your almost a pipeline, you can then trace
Yeah, yeah,
everything from the very end when LLM says there might be a problem to the IPA that you fed to a
yeah,
certain device, to a certain config. Nice.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, just to finish this off, a few platforms which sort of I'm aware of.
Hmm.
I probably had much more experience with Taloka specifically than anybody else, but yeah, I just wanted to share, a little bit more. I didn't really have too much success with MTurk, to be honest, which was a little bit surprising for me because that was like a trendsetter a few
Yeah.
years back. So
Hmm.
yeah, it was really, really hard to do. Taloka just has like really nice API that allows for all this kind of stuff, like upload videos, get all these responses, pay to the people who did the work well, and so on and so on. But yeah, right now we have like a lot of other options as well. So yeah, just explore and give it a try and see whatever works. And just to mention that for device farm specifically, so usually what happens is that so my first idea was that I will have some sort of device and that would have a state and I will be able to
Hmm.
explore this state via API or whatever.
Yeah.
And usually platforms don't really allow for that because of safety.
Hmm.
So they want everything sort of being built together. So instead of doing that, what we do is we have a testing sort of suite on the
Hmm.
device,
Hmm.
which contains a script which is an Appium script in this case. I mean,
Hmm.
you can do something else as well,
Yeah.
obviously, but that's just what I went for. And this script, it does exactly that. It takes a screenshot like each second or whatever, sends it to backend saying that, what, here the state of the app,
Hmm.
all these kind of things that you can do. Here the image, and then backend sort of answers with what action it needs to perform, and it performs this action.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So
So
it's a scripted use of your app.
yeah, 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 yeah. To be honest, it was not super fun to debug
Okay, I can imagine.
because, yeah, because yeah, it's a little bit hard. But yeah, luckily Appium has this local mode, so I could, just turn on my phone and see what happens here.
Hmm.
And also a lot of sort of corner cases, like, with system notifications, they are not really a part of your, interface, so you
Yeah.
can't really interact with them the similar way. So you need to, do some
Yeah,
stuff.
because they are the part of the OS rather than your app.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's really sort of diminishing the value as of now because, it's really hard to create such a platform which is, available for all apps because
Yeah.
of all of this kind of thing that they can have.
Hmm.
A lot of, like interface kind of things that might be different and the system stuff as well. But in general, I would say that setting up such a system is not like super challenging. You just need to, put some time into it and it's pretty much clear
So
what
do
to
you
do.
have a testers team now?
Yeah, actually, yes. We were running without a QA team for many years, to be honest. And
Okay.
basically, the idea was that, yeah, at the very first stage of, startup of basically any product, you don't really have too complicated system
Yeah.
initially.
Hmm.
Obviously, later on it changes probably.
Yeah.
So we were relying on just our sort of capabilities here.
Hmm.
Also, crowdsourcing testing was a really, really large part.
Yeah.
And then you also have um, actually the second uh, topic, which is sort of shell level testing.
Yeah.
Yeah, which allows us to basically look at what happens with the users, what happens with the requests and just react in time. So you might have this approach where you create the product and you want to ensure that everything works as you wish, basically,
Yeah.
and you only launch it when you sort of checked everything. And you have the second approach where you basically create something, you do stuff, and then you see if it breaks, you just fix it very, very fast.
Yeah.
So I would say that in our case, probably the second option is preferable because you just need to, move really, really fast as a startup. Otherwise you would just be dead.
And also, your product is so full of AI, LLM, whatever you call it,
Yeah.
full of magic stuff which can't be possibly deterministically tested. So you
Yeah,
can't.
absolutely.
It's like I talked to JetBrains folks, and they said that testing LLM within an IDE is very hard because if you're testing something like Copilot, what's your end-to-end test? So you're selecting a piece of code, and what's the expected outcome? It's hard to tell. For you, it's pretty much the same because you train and train and train and train your models all the time.
Yeah, I agree to that. I would say that, yeah, in my experience, this IDE LLM integration, they don't really work too well. Uh, yeah. Mm. And I would say that another part which is probably relevant to them is basically the variety of the context, right? So, for
Yeah,
example, you can have, you know, yeah, basically different internal kind of tooling around all of
sure.
that, and you need to take it into account potentially. And yeah, it's really hard to test, obviously. Uh, yeah, so I would say that if sort of, risk-wise,
Hmm.
if it's appropriate to be in this sort of reactive state where you have, some measurements, some monitors, and then you react based on them,
Hmm.
then just go for it. Again, this is probably not for, everybody, not on every stage, not for every team, but that's just what worked for me like really, really well. And
Yeah,
yeah,
it's like
I would
I
say
had
that.
a speaker from Siemens, and he is testing trains and trains infrastructure.
Hmm.
I guess fail fast doesn't work for them.
Yeah, yeah, for them definitely no, also think like, healthcare, like
Yeah.
insurance, banking maybe. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah, payments processing as as in
Hmm.
like Google Payments as I worked like yeah, we were testing like really, really hard everything and with a lot of I would say like really creative things that we did to the system to check if if it's failure resistant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, Um, so yeah, not on every stage, not for everybody, but I would say that at least this is something to consider because in some cases that would really make a lot of sense. Yeah. So what I wanted to share here is
Hmm.
basically yeah. So shell level basically meaning that you have something, it's in the shell, so you have the access to this shell. You don't really know what's inside, and you don't really care.
Yeah.
Uh, Yeah,
So it
and
was
I would
it
say,
was I think I read that it was mentioned as black box testing, but shell level is better term for this.
yeah, we just don't, yeah, we just don't use this sort of terminology. So
Yeah.
yeah, and to be honest, shell level specifically, kudos here go to the Google Payments team because I think I learned it there, and I don't really know anybody else who who really uses that. But I think that's super cool. Yeah, like you really care about the shell, like what's outside, what's inside,
Yeah.
and you don't really think what's it built from.
Hmm.
So yeah, so one part I would say which is really important to me is that sometimes it's really hard to properly break down your system, right? So, um,
I've seen this. I've seen companies which employed chaos testing as one of the
yeah,
approaches to deal with this situation. And one of my speakers, she said that when they started drawing the graph, the diagram of microservices and services interconnections, they were like, wow, this is impossible to even think about properly, let alone test.
yeah, and I would say that in many cases, it probably comes very naturally that you need to really break down things. So, for example, in web search, what we did is basically we had, for all the small things that we have on the web search page, like you have like organic links, you have like ads, you have like widgets and whatever. You would have some metrics for everything of that sort.
Yeah,
And then it's really helpful because when you make changes you sort of you really need to take care of all of that and to see what happens, and you need some level of granularity to really see the change as well, because if you look
sure.
at the whole picture, in many cases you just don't see the difference.
Hmm.
So it makes a lot of sense for these kind of products, but then what happens is you can really lose the sense of like the big picture, right? So you change these little things, and then you see the whole results, and you're like, "All right, what really changed? I have no clue." That was really a struggle for me in many cases where we working on press releases for web search releases,
Hmm.
where I know that we had like this release and this release and like thousand more releases, but then I look at the results like now and like 5 years ago and like going like, "All right,
Okay.
I think it was okay. I mean, yeah, we did something, but yeah, it's really hard to you know." look at that and say, "Oh my God, this is the innovation that we were working like for 5 years." So in many cases, I would say that you need to have this granularity with your metrics, with your measurements, with monitorings and stuff, but you really need to have this shell level thing. So basically,
Yeah.
if as as everything comes together, does it work like we intended to?
Yeah, it's like with narrow burning ROM, the burning software which died. Everything was perfect. They even launched internet radio feature, which works really well on the burning software.
Mm.
None of the users wanted, I think, wanted this functionality. But yeah, so they lost the overall picture and they died.
That happens a lot, You can't really be sure, but yeah, I would say that this is something which was missing from many systems that I worked with.
Mhm.
Again, I would say in Google Payments it was like top notch. To be honest, I mean,
Nice.
no surprise, I would say in Google, when you see things like that. So basically, the idea was that all right, we have a lot of stuff going on, all these microservices talking to each other. It was, I think, your example is really great, but in Google Payments, at least what I saw was like 5,000 services doing something. Obviously, nobody knew what they do. Like I don't know. Maybe I touched like five of them at
Hmm.
my whole time. So really, there's no way you can cover this properly. And what's also important is that they have a lot of changes, right? So today it's these 5,000. Like tomorrow it's like you remove 500 and then it 500
Yeah.
more. So yeah, you always have this
So,
situation where metrics sort of and monitor they need to catch up, right?
mhm.
And when you have the shell level testing, on the other hand, you don't really need to do this. Like it's
Yeah.
either working at the whole, or it doesn't. So that's kind of cool. Yeah, and the second part is basically, yeah, what we covered a lot is non-deterministic outputs, right? So you don't really know what it needs to answer. So you can't
Hmm.
really go into like unit testing of sorts.
Yeah.
And also you can't really prepare these functional tests, suits as well, because they're not really clear, they are not really specific. So what we do here. So one thing is that just as approach, you test system as a whole without any breakdowns, at least at the very beginning. But obviously, you later on you add some layers to that, right? To kind of be able to break down really into to fix
Hmm.
stuff basically. But to see if everything works, you do this shell level sort of tests and props and stuff. Then you substitute like binary testing basically, where you have right or wrong with sort
Hmm.
of quality measurements, like 80% accuracy or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, and together they have this sort of shell level quality measurement going on. So I will give you a number of examples here. So for example, again, we have this product recognition feature in the app, right? So
Hmm.
for example, I have this picture on the left, again, taken like today morning. Uh, Here it goes. Yeah, yeah. My star. So when it recognizes, you can say that this is right and this is wrong, right? So for
Hmm.
example, the product on the left is correct and the product on the right is incorrect. Again, you can do this with things like LLMs quite easily. Like this is the picture, this is the information that we gathered, from our system. Please tell me if you have something wrong. Again, you need to put some thought into it because there's lots of nuance here, but in general, it's as easy as saying that is this a proper answer, and you already have a measurement. So again, at the very beginning, I would say that this is already enough because imagine you have like 100 examples, and you can check that you have 100 answers, and you have no panics, no
No
some
degradation.
no degradation. Basically, you have the latency measurements as
Yeah.
well. So you can test a lot of stuff, and then you can have this quality measurement on top of that. So no matter what happens, you kind of have this, minimal assurance level that thing is working. It makes sense, so I can sleep basically.
Yeah, so you choose you define the necessary variety yourself here, saying that I want to check five um, exfoliants and five something else and 10 of something else. And if your current release or current state of the system does verify, so does detect it properly, then chances are it's in right state. And
Yeah,
if you want, you can go from 100 to 1000 if your risks are higher. But then again, it's doable here. Yes.
yeah. So I would say this is just, important as a concept because then you can go, like we might have some setups for like super fast and super easy
Hmm.
checks, like, smoke type testing for production, like
Rapid
running right
feedback.
now.
Hmm.
Yeah, and you can have like more sophisticated things when you're making a release to check the release, and then you have something
Hmm.
in the middle, you know. So you have this variety here, and yeah, as you told, this is basically up to you what you do exactly
Hmm.
at this moment, right?
Yeah, you can even focus on the speed of feedback. So, like you said, with kind of a smoke testing, you can even proceed doing development. With
Yeah.
kind of in the middle, you can put it at night to work at night and like proper release to make it once a week or on the weekend. Proper release testing.
Yeah, again, I think that this really improved the quality of life, right? So, for example, again, the system becomes more and more complex. You can't really, draw in your head what happens when you do certain things. So,
Yeah.
you can obviously forget about something going here and there. So, yeah, if you have this set of tests, right, that work on the highest level possible, at least you can say that yeah, probably nothing like too drastic happened. Uh, and yeah, you can think as well as, like revenue and just users and, like complain that they feel like the number of tickets in your, support system also as a measurements of the quality here. So if you don't see anything, going on there, probably again, this is also a signal here.
It could be a good signal, yes. But then again, it could be a signal that your whole system is broken.
Including the measurement
Yes.
stuff. Yeah, that
Yeah.
happens. That also happens. Yeah. So I would say, yeah, you have this, and then you have like hands-on experience, right? And if your hands-on experience just differs from what you see in your monitoring system, then yeah, this is also a signal. So
Mhm.
yeah, obviously, no, this is not the case that you do this and you just basically cover it and you don't need to do anything else. I would say that this is just another way of thinking, and probably a good addition to what you might have as well.
Yeah.
So if you case studies here in web search specifically, for example, so what the trick with web search is that imagine you have like billion requests per day, right? it's like, yeah, it's a lot. And half of them are basically the requests that you would never see again.
Yeah.
So, you know, you have like 20, 30 years of history, and like half of the requests that you get daily are unique requests. Like nobody ever in the history of universe would ask exactly like that. So yeah, measuring quality is quite a challenge. And obviously
Yeah.
there's a lot of, just stuff happening. So for example, if there's an important event happening right now, then everybody would ask about that.
Mhm.
So probably, up to like half of your request would be about that, like, like Olympics or something. And then this kind of, goes away and it returns, back to normal where, like decent chunk of like Google requests is YouTube and, I don't know, like
Yeah.
GPT or whatever,
And
whatever is popular.
these requests may never come back again.
As well, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially like Olympics,
Yeah.
2016 or whatever. There's always some tail, but in general, the case. So, what was done in web search? I mean, one of the things that was done, okay. So we took like a few hundreds of popular requests, and we were basically, pushing it to the system like every minute or like every 5 minutes or whatever.
Mm.
And then you have actually very nice signals. So for web search, you really need a lot of people to measure this quality, right? So you
Mhm.
have the answers. So you can do this, and you can then measure the quality and see that, if it's above certain set threshold, then everything's okay. But
Mhm.
then there's also the second sort of dimension here, which is whether the results are drastically different from their last option. So when you have a certain like personalization profile for the user, which you used
Right.
for this type, right? So basically, you need like 99% of the answer being the same, and you can literally make it a very technical measurement, like if anything
Hmm.
has changed. So
So
this is all.
you take 100 popular requests for a certain type of user every day and you rerun them, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And
Hmm.
like when you need people to really assess the quality, you would probably need, at least some minutes, maybe like tens of minutes
Yeah.
on top of, what you had to really make the conclusion. But when you just change, if you have, any differences in the set of results that they provide,
Yeah.
you already have something which works basically real time, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Algorithmically done.
yeah,
Yes.
so that's also, very important notion. I would say that just change detection, right? So when you expect the change to happen, that's okay. When you don't, just monitor for that. That's already kind of cool.
It feels like, that you're talking about, there is a popular concept. I don't like it, but it's quite popular about a testing pyramid. And
Oh my
you're
God.
adding even more on top of it, even more closer to the users things.
I really like them. Yeah, I
Mm.
must admit, I really like them because, yeah, the closer I can sort of,
Hmm.
measure it, just the cleaner the signal is.
Yeah.
Again, I would say that, you might argue that, in certain cases that would be unviable, or maybe, like it would be too much burden on the team to, to look for all that stuff. Obviously, that might be the case. Obviously, this is not for, everybody in every situation, but at least for, many situations that might be a really useful addition in my mind.
I think it's a great tool that, and the whole approach is a great tool in your tool belt. And whether
Yeah.
your business requirements and business context demands it or not, only then you either use it or not.
Yeah, but I would say that in my experience, it's much more frequent that it sort of supports and it
Hmm.
would benefit a lot, but we sort of don't just consider that, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe, it's just a too new of a concept, but then the problem
Yeah,
is always,
it's very similar to what you talked about from the crowdsource testing perspective. I never, before we started even discussing this with you, I've never heard of companies using crowdsource testing.
Mhm.
And to me, this tool makes so much sense. Like I can instantly find ways for pretty much all the products I worked for where this particular tool could be used.
I totally agree. I really think that it's underutilized, and I don't really know why. Yeah, so
Hmm.
probably we need to, just do what we do, make,
Popularize. Yeah.
Yeah. So the second example is again with payments processing. I would say that in Google it was like a really like excellent case. So basically the idea was that you have, something of API gateway source, right? So you have certain connector for, every client.
Mm-hmm.
And then you just look at this client, right? So you have latency, you have errors, like you have, 400s, 500s, anything else than like 200s and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So if you know that on this API gateway level you don't have any 500s, for example, then probably you're covered in terms of at least backend processing, right?
Yeah.
So you don't really test here for, let's say, if it makes sense what it returns, right?
Mm-hmm. But
Which
it
is
works.
Yeah, which is usually the quality measurement again. So
Yeah.
it's a different type of test, right? But at least you know that it works, and it, doesn't work too slow and everything like of
Mm-hmm.
that sort. So that covered a lot of bases. And again, what's for me, it was the most important part that you don't really need to know what's inside, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It
Uh,
either works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, that's the great signal you have to utilize all your other monitoring and debugging and everything else to go and figure out.
Yeah, also it was a really great coverage, So for example, if we know on this shell level that something breaks,
Mm-hmm.
then usually we know which sort of downstream call was failing as well, so you can kind of, debug into
Go
it
deep.
and see
Yeah.
what happens.
Mm-hmm.
For payments, it was always a little bit tricky because payments, unlike many other systems, they really depend on external things like, like Visa,
Third
banks, or
party. Yeah.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so we really spend a lot of time trying to figure like which kinds of failures are really not ours, but theirs, which is,
And what's interesting here is that regardless of how well you test it during your release process, let's say, it might break tomorrow. And if you don't have monitoring, you're just screwed.
yeah, it's not cool at all. And I would say
Yeah.
that one of the most sort of tricky cases where when something breaks outside,
Yeah.
but you also have a release, so you don't really
Yeah.
know.
Hmm.
Yeah,
What
that was
caused
super.
the failure?
Yeah, yeah, and the second large part was that you don't really know so you don't really know the level of urgency. So, for example,
Yeah.
if you're losing like $1 million a minute, probably that's a different story. When you don't lose anything, but that's just some sort of a backend thing just going crazy. So that was also a large part to kind of impact analysis, on the fly,
Hmm.
especially. So again, for this, you need some sort of quality measurement. For example, the expected amount of payments, going through the system, and if it changes a lot, then probably you
Hmm.
need to look into it.
Hmm.
Another great example, and it's really like super simple. I really like it. Is load balancers in AWS or basically in any other system. So what they do, right? They just ping your service, and if it answers with
That's
certain
okay.
response,
Hmm.
that's okay. Yeah. So it's super simple. Like it's super generic. It doesn't check everything, right? Well, but it checks a lot of stuff, you know. So I really like this concept, and I think it's very powerful. And I would say that in many cases we tend to overcomplicate things,
Hmm.
while in reality, like we have this like product recognition, right? Just send an image here, and if it responds, then you know for the most part you're covered. Um,
What's also interesting here is that we humans can only bear so much of cognitive complexity. So if I have 50 screens here, I would not be able to consciously
yeah,
analyze anything. So I need to narrow down the amount of signals to such a number that I can actually understand and comprehend and act upon. And this is very important here that if I'm looking at something, I'm exaggerating, but like lines of code of tests executed, this
yeah, yeah.
number might give me something, but in very certain scenario, not in the scenario of monitoring of the whole product.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I would say this is also important for for the on-call sort of duty,
Yeah.
because yeah, again, in my experience, the largest portion of the stress there is basically about impact analysis, right? So you don't really know how important is this, so you
Hmm.
stress a ton because you just you just you can't handle this uncertainty.
Yeah.
And yeah, when you have, as you told, right, a very limited amount of high-level indicators that say you know what, if anything, it's not like, critical level.
Yeah.
Then you can take your time, you can look deep into it, you can decide what to do.
Hmm.
Whilst, for example, if it's really, really critical, then probably you just need not to do anything other than like wake up everybody and say, like we are on fire.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
like in medicine, triage is
yeah, yeah, yeah,
specifically limiting the amount of the number of symptoms they're looking at, like
yeah,
heart rate, something else, and something else, three or four of them, and only these four. And then an amateur, a new joiner to the doctor's team will say, "But what about X-ray? But what about? Well, we don't have time for that. Sorry."
yeah, yeah. And funnily enough, in the SRE, we actually had this notion. So we had the triage stage where
Hmm.
basically so whenever you have an incident, you basically start with triage and saying that how important it is, how impactful it is. And then you go into mitigation. And the
Hmm.
important distinction is that you mitigate but not fix.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, and then after you mitigate, you sort of decide what to do next. And it
Because
might be
mitigation
fixing.
can be a rollback instead of fixing, for
It
example.
might be rollback. It might be as simple as, just move all the traffic into different geography or whatever. So,
Hmm.
in many cases, yeah, mitigation is much, much simpler. And then you can decide like what do you need next. Maybe you can just leave it as it is, until like morning or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, in our case, we just monitor like the quality of recognition, the speed, and everything of that sort. So again, you have this sort of levels from as simple as load balancer does, like, do you really answer to simple pings, to
Hmm.
like some.
And my internet disappeared. I'm back.
So imagine,
Sorry.
I'm really happy to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so right, you have the inputs, you have the outputs, and you have something in between, right?
Yeah.
Which basically covers the notion of shell here, right?
Hmm.
So from this perspective, there are again several ways, and all of them are sort of useful in certain scenarios again. So one thing is just log inputs and log the outputs and measure the quality of these pairs. Uh, then you can, calculate the outputs based on the inputs, which would be also a test of source. But the thing is, in many cases, we don't do both of these things. So for example, I have an API for recognizing stuff, right?
Hmm.
And then our app sort of calls this API. So I think, okay, I want to measure the quality of this thing. Then I will take the inputs that are, input into the system. I will sort of sample them in a way, calculate the outputs and say, yeah, our quality is this or that. But then you don't really measure the quality of how well do you, model this system.
Mm,
So,
right.
yeah. So, for example, your user queries might differ, in any way. I mean, in my case, there was like hundreds of times when we had a certain, like CGI parameter that is coming from the client, but we forgot about it in our tests. So, it happens. Again, returning to the idea that, measure as close to the user as possible, it makes a lot of sense to measure just what was the input, what was the output, and just, whatever. And then when you have that and you have the calculated outputs as well, you can say that, okay, my system sort of works.
Mhm.
I can use this, for example, for release testing, for uh, just developing the quality or whatever. It sort of represents the real system pretty well, right?
Mhm.
Also, for example, if you have a new release and you expect the quality to go up, then you need to see this in logs as well.
Yeah.
This often, happens when you roll out the change and you roll out something different because the change, management is sort of hard.
Yeah.
So it's
It's
really easy
hard
to
to
do.
isolate. Yeah.
Yeah, so for new releases, obviously, you calculate new outputs, you measure the quality, and you see what the different, but then you need to see this in logs as well. And obviously, there's also a way to model the user inputs as well. So for example, in our case, for a long time, actually, we didn't use the inputs of the users at all due to
Right.
privacy issues because,
Hmm.
those are images and, anything can happen here. So we need to do a lot of work to kind of make it safe, right?
Yeah.
So what we did, we actually took the images from again, from crowdsourcing. So we
Yeah.
asked people to take pictures of their, let's say, cosmetic products, right? And use this as an input. And then it always was the question whether, these inputs are sort of relevant to what our users do, which was always on the back of my mind, and it really wasn't, to be honest, because again, in terms of demography, in terms of countries, it's much different from what our users are.
So you
So
had to launch your crowdsourcing essentially on the very relevant markets, socio-geographically, demographically, etc., in order to
that's
get proper models.
that's one way of thinking about it, but the other is that I would say, all right, and that's okay. I'm
Mm.
just measuring a little bit more variety than it is,
Hmm.
which is also a good way to do stuff.
Yeah.
So I would say that usually in our test it was like these kind of very high variability type of input sources, for example, crowdsourcing, usually the metrics there are much lower than in production. Because what happens in production, basically everybody, make shots of like 10 or maybe like 500 different products, and everything other than that is like 10% or maybe like 15%, right? So if you cover this sort of big really, really well, you basically have the working system, right? It is already useful, but then
Yeah.
you have everything else. So when you have this high variability source, you basically cover more the sort of long tail
All
of
right.
cases.
So with the crowdsourcing tool, you can even have a higher variety
Yeah,
than your users will have. All right. That's very interesting.
yeah. I would say usually the case.
Hmm.
Probably, not in the way that, if you have like million users, then probably in terms of like OS variations or whatever, you basically have much variety than, let's say, 200 users that you have in your crowdsourcing testing, right? But in terms of just how much different data, how much different, environment they have, and also important fact is that you really have access to that, right? Because they have different terms of service,
Yeah.
so you basically, you can even talk to them like, what did you do here, there, and so on. So just better level of detailization that you have. So that's
Oh my
also very,
gosh.
very,
In this scenario, what I'm seeing from the cybernetics perspective, you are controlling the variety of test cases or test scenarios. So, like, if you, I'm imagining, but if you're only targeting a certain market, let's say the UK, in the UK, the variety is this, but you can control your testing variety to be this or even higher, so that
yeah.
chances will be, the probability will be that your local market that you're targeting will be well covered with the variety you're testing. Nice.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. And, in my mind, it's always useful because at some point you will go outside of your market, and
Yeah.
if you have no preparation whatsoever, again, I would say for specifically like ML type of applications, it's always very, tricky when they focus too much on their current audience because,
Yeah.
if you have like million of users right now, well, we don't have like 4 billion other potential users that we might have, right? So when
Yeah.
you draw a conclusion of this million, you need to understand that this is a very small fraction of, the like potential audience. So you don't really need to overstate, you're welcome here. You need to, go into larger audiences
I've seen
in
it
this regard.
happening when a company working on a local market only and had really good NPS, like almost 9.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then they launched in some other company, like some Eastern countries, and they had NPS dropping while people were buying more and more of their services, and they were scratching their head like, what the hell? And essentially, some sociologists told them that NPS actually differs across cultures. That was fun.
Yeah, yeah, obviously, that's that's one example. Yeah, so yeah, I think that's a way to increase the variety in many, many cases.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
That's
So
nice.
just wanted to share just one more example from sort of our case, right? I just wanted to double down on this, like modeling a certain specific, for example, scenario, right? So here I actually covered in on my LinkedIn. So anyway, like and subscribe. So for example, what we can do with modeling basically, right? Or even with logs as well, right? So we can specify some subsets of requests that you process. So for example, in our case, for cosmetic recognition, basically we have two parts. We have the answer from our database and we have everything else. So, in some cases, we understand that we don't have this product, so we don't have any information. So we'll collect this information online and we'll present the answer to the user anyway, which is sort of really, really cool. But we really want to work on reducing the share of these cases, right? Because they are slower, they are sort of more expensive and so on. So we had a certain scenario where we have, these sort of set of requests that are more likely to end up in online scanner rather than in database. And then we make a certain change to the system, basically adding some certain elements to the database. So, presumably the result should be different.
Yeah.
And we really measure the metrics on this specific subset. And I think it's really important because when you look at a certain change, it basically, pretty rarely it covers like everything that you do.
Yeah.
More likely that it covers a certain area of stuff happening. So, for example, if I take the metrics on everything that comes into the system, then probably I would see no difference, and I would say, yeah, why should
You
we?
would not be able to notice even if degradation started slowly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I need a more specific check, right? So
Yeah.
I sort of end up doing this kind of check where we have a certain subset of queries and we can check the metrics on them and we see a very, very nice results. So we can say that, it makes a lot of sense. Or in this case, for example, when we populate the database with relevant products, basically the share of online responses, it dropped like 5 times, like 6 times, right? And response rate becomes almost 100. So we say,
Hmm.
yeah, this is the way to go. This is the way to kind of set up our feedback loop process, because we know that the set of queries that are sort of affected are basically improving in quality. So if we do this a lot of time, then probably we'll see on the high level as well. And
Nice. Yeah.
also, what I like about this as well is that when you have a certain subset of queries, subset of requests, subset of scenarios, you can definitely share all these metrics like no problem, because
Hmm.
nobody really knows what that means. You don't really know our regular responses share on
Yeah.
overall picture, overall response rate or whatever. So it's really really safe, and yeah. So I really like this approach. Uh, yeah. So that's basically, I would say, cover the shell level testing pretty well.
I particularly like this part. So, like when I'm thinking about quality assurance, I always think first about how I can imitate my user, because essentially the user doesn't care what amount of unit tests I have, or end-to-end tests, or functional, or any other types of tests, or even if I have tests at all. Users want to have a good service from the product I'm building and a good experience. So first question for me in quality assurance is how I can imitate my users in such a way that would make economical sense for the company and for the users as well. Because of course I can like set a team of 1 million testers and not launch any product within any foreseeable future, right? But users won't like it. Users won't be able to benefit from my services. And so with crowdsource testing, you are controlling the variety of users. So essentially, it's very easy to answer the question how to imitate users. You define how to imitate users, who your users are. So for me, it's like a steroids on steroids version of dog fooding or canary. So with dog fooding, I can only have my folks in my
Yeah.
company doing the you using the product, and we all have mental sets. We all have happy paths in our mind. Testers, of course, they have negative testing and edge case testing, etc. But then still, we are very limited. With crowdsourcing, you can increase the limits to whatever you want, and you also show that it's quite cheap. So if you set it right, it's not like you're adding 10 people to your team. That's very interesting. And for shell level testing, I just think that it is closer to the user. And if it gives us signals on what to look into, what to dig into deeper, then it's the way. Like there is no other way, there is no other proper signal than seeing that something is broken on the user side.
Yeah, I really, really like this take, and I say that, yeah, probably not pronounced enough, but the idea, yeah, I would say that you really care about, the whole system as it behaves
Mhm.
with regards to the user and their sort of
Hmm.
scenario. So yeah, that's all. I would say that's just, like instrumental way of describing it as a shell
Hmm.
level sort of, measurements and quality and whatever. But essentially, yes, we are just really wanting to. I would say that, if you cover this a little bit, right, about NPS, right? So
Hmm.
in a way, you can think that NPS is also, this kind of shell level
Yeah,
metric for you. And again, support, like the store reviews and whatever, you can think of them as well. And
sure.
then you can think that, yeah, so there are scenarios and I can, measure the quality of the scenarios as well from logs or, from modeling or whatever. So these are all just levels for us to get closer to the user. I would say that the closer we are, the less details we have, right? Because
True.
you can't really reach out to a certain person. You don't have video recordings or whatever. And
Hmm.
further we get from them, the more details we have. So what's important is that there is this aspect to that, and not only things like you know comfortability of like development or
Yeah.
like maintaining all this stuff and so on. So
Or
yeah,
ease
I
of
think that
change. It's
yeah.
very interesting when I show this Arduino to my mom and show the website to which this Arduino reports signals to, and she tells me it doesn't work. So this is very close to the user. It's the input from the user, and yet it's very hard for me to get any meaningful data from my mom because she's not as literate with computers as I am, let's say so. And so yeah, but this is the most important part. So it doesn't work for her. So I don't care how many end-to-end tests I have for my Arduino. It doesn't work for her.
Yeah, that's actually really, I think it's really important, thing. So I would say that in many cases, what you see, right? So as a developers, what we do, we say, all right, something doesn't work, give me the details, give me like a
Yeah.
user ID, give me like, the app version or whatever. And once I don't have that, I would say, you know what, this is not a real, bug report, just,
Yeah.
go away. I'm too busy. Well, in reality, those are probably the most important ones.
Yeah.
And we just need to find a way to kind of draw the line, right? So something doesn't work. So how do we detect
Mm-hmm.
this? And if we have a lot of complaints, but we don't have any, artifacts in the system, then probably we
Mm-hmm.
need to do something else.
And also people who are complaining, it's not all the people who have problems. So for 10 people
Yeah,
who have
yeah,
problems, 7 will just go away, right? And we won't receive a bad review. Or even if we receive a bad review or bad feedback from users, chances are they won't be ready to set up remote desktop to their computer and
yeah, yeah,
see how
yeah,
it works on
absolutely.
their site. Like they are already angry with our services. So it's always better to have signals before they actually start complaining.
Yeah. And speaking of that, I have the third part here, which
Yay.
hopefully helps with that. And yeah, this is what we call dark launches.
Yes.
Also, one thing that I learned from Google. So yeah, kudos to Google, honestly. So again, you say like, I want to know whether people would have any problems with my release before I release it.
Mhm.
And one thing to do is canary release, right? When you have basically some set of users, serving traffic from a new version, and you just limit the amount of impact that you might have. So, for example, we had this notion of exponential releases where we have like one
Yeah.
instance going to the new version, and then we just wait, and then we have like two, and then we have like 10, and like 100, and like then like 10% and whatever.
Mhm.
So, but still, with canary testing, you will have some percentage of the user basically being affected by the outage, whether it happens, right?
Yeah.
So one way to go about it is, well, dark launches, okay? But in reality, I would say that this concept is much more powerful, and I will try to cover that as well, because in my mind, this could be thought as a general way of preparing the system for the release in a way that really makes the change management really, really easy in a way.
It affects the design of the change.
Yeah, and that's as well, yeah. And
Mhm.
also, very important part is that it's not easy to implement this kind of testing for every system. There
Mhm.
definitely are systems which are not really built for that. So for example, systems with feedback loops, where you have, something happening in the system which affects the future behavior of the system.
Mhm.
Uh, the easiest way of thinking about such example is basically, you have, so for example, the user, makes a request and then you change something with their profile, which is not based
Mhm.
on their input, but based on like some decision that you make. So, in this case, that is a little bit more tricky. But anyway, in many
Like
cases, that's
trading.
like trading or like, recommendation systems,
Hmm.
like anything with really somewhat sophisticated databases set
Hmm.
up, when you just store the data of interactions and you use it in a way.
Hmm.
One example actually really interesting is that, for example, we remember the time zone of the user, so that we can, make push notifications or whatever, and we change it based on the, like on the latest, request that we receive. So if we repeat this request, then probably we will rewrite this data, and probably that would affect the quality of the, product for the user. So,
Hmm.
you need to be careful about that. But again, I return to the idea. So I decided that probably the best way to go about this is to give an example. So one case is that just read through Google blog. They actually cover this really, really well. I would say that probably their blog goes, much more into the technical side of things rather than, let's say, research type of things. So I will try to cover this a little bit more, again, from like my perspective. So the idea that, okay, for example, I have this product recognition tool, right? So I have input image, then it goes to API gateway of sorts, then we recognize it, then we evaluate the product, and then we kind of get the resulting page. So that's good and all. Let's say I want to launch a new version of basically any part of that, right? Except for API gateway, obviously, because
Hmm.
that would be a completely different story. So, for example, I have a different recognition, service or different evaluation service or whatever. So, what I would do, okay, I will, research it, develop it. I will, run some tests. I will measure quality metrics and whatever. But then I have somewhat reasonable, somewhat reasonable system that I want to launch in the prod. So, what do I do
Yeah.
next? One way of doing this, again, canary testing, but again with some limitations. So what I do here is basically for some percentage of the traffic, I will duplicate this request to the new system, and it will go all the way and will end up somewhere in logs. So the
Hmm.
results wouldn't be presented to the user, right? Because we are not quite sure if the system is ready for production. But we will log it, and that really allows for many, many things. So one thing you would say, yes, this basically increases the load on your system. If you draw like 100% of the traffic, you basically double the capacity for capacity requirements for the system, which is fair enough,
Fair.
obviously. Yeah, but then again, in real systems, you basically have some type of redundancy in place, so probably you can do this, no problem.
And also you weigh when you think about this, you weigh the risks and the cost. So your cost of the increase of traffic, of doubling the traffic, or one thirding of the traffic is this, and your
Yeah.
risks that you're trying to assess are these. So if the risks outweigh, well, then you do
Yeah,
it.
yeah. No, I think that's a very fair point, and I would say that in practice, you usually do this for like very impactful things, which are
Hmm.
not super often.
Hmm.
I must
Where,
say
where
that,
the risk of impacting, negatively impacting even canary users is higher than the cost, reputational, etc., etc.
yeah, and in some cases you can't really do anything other than that, which I will also
Mm,
try to cover,
okay.
because that also happens with systems that require sort of, a saturation phase where they need to be run for a certain time to kind
Oh,
of, yeah.
okay.
In fact, we also had this in payments as well, which is kind of funny because, currently I'm working like, machine learning AI type of processing, which require this in many cases. But in payments, for many batch analytical processes, you also need this kind of stuff. So, for example, imagine your server, it needs like a week of processing to
Hmm.
kind of populate all the caches or whatever, all the
Hmm.
statistics, and only then it can be actually pushed into production. So you will also try to do something like that.
Hmm.
Yeah. So with these logs, you basically do everything that we talked about earlier, right? So you run some tests, you see what's happening, you look at the latency, you look at the errors. In many, many cases, you would do this, and the first thing it would, come around is basically a lot of, like failures, panics, all of that
Mm-hmm.
start. And the thing is that in many cases, you just can't really cover all the variety of the inputs that you get. So for many applications, you will tell that, you know what, I can just go to my site, I can push some buttons and that will be all right. So, I know that it works for everybody. But, imagine like, again, web search having like billions of requests, every every day.
Mm-hmm.
You can have all sorts of stuff. And the thing is that, the system is so complex. So for one request, you have one part working, for another request, you have other part working, and you have all these kinds of interactions and stuff, and all of different kinds of failure modes for different services. So you really need to, make sure that everything is basically covered. And
Mm-hmm.
there's no better way of doing this than basically, launching every kind of request into the system.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would say that if you have a complex system, if you have a large number of corner cases, and when I mean large, I mean like, like millions of them, you literally like millions of them. You have multiple contexts. For example, in our case, you can launch certain things like assistant engine right from one page or from other page, and you have like all kinds of pages, and it needs to work and everything like that. And I have my favorite example here that, again, with web search, having this large amount of queries, right, you can say that if something works for one day, then probably just has no bugs. So funnily enough, we had a situation where a 12 years old code break.
Right.
Yeah, and it was like one request, again, one simple request in like 12 years of
Mm-hmm.
having like hundreds of millions to like billions of,
Oh my gosh.
requests every day,
Mm-hmm.
and you will still see some of that stuff happening. So that's really, I would say that was somewhat impressive. And you don't really like these cases where everything breaks, and you
Mm-hmm.
sort of you don't work, and you need to fix stuff, and you have all these kind of troubles. But then again, just to understand how complex the system might be, that with
Mm-hmm.
such rigorous testing, you still have something that doesn't work, and you know that you have more inside the system. You just you just have no idea how to find it, right?
Yeah. And this is
So
particularly dangerous in older systems where the amount of testing, automated or any other testing, is less than you want, but getting to understand even the old system is very hard.
yeah, and in many cases you just don't have anybody
Yeah.
around who worked on
Yeah.
that for like
Hmm.
many years. So yeah, I would say that's a good approach where you basically again return to the shell level way of thinking, right? You just have one shell and you have another shell, and you kind of just
Yeah.
try them, and if another shell you understand well and it works well, then you
Hmm.
can just remove the old one and replace it, and that's a way to go. So that's also the I would say the use case for this stuff. Also,
Hmm.
what is good for it? So one thing is again early detection of bugs and some degradations. Again, in our case, currently it's not like web search, when you have this really insane level of usage, but still, I would say that in many cases, what happens is that, for example, I have like thousands of requests to test the system, to measure the quality and so on. So you would tell, yeah, like what, like thousands is already good enough. Probably nothing would break. It will break still.
Yeah.
So yeah, you just launched it and you have real traffic going in. So basically, things just break and you see what happens. Now, the second big part is that you really can make changes in the system in this sort of test environment, and you are free to do so. It's sort of safe, because again, in many cases, for example, you can't really go with Canary. For example, imagine this, right? So I have a new system and I have like 2% of the users going into it, right? Still, I need to think a lot as to what I do, and I need to test it, and I when I roll out SAO, I need to check if everything is going on, and so on. Here I can just push some code and go to sleep, because I know that this is a separate environment. So if it breaks like all the night long, nobody really cares, unless you have like terabytes of core files going into yours or whatever. But yeah, anyway, you can break it as you want, and production is
Mhm.
not really affected, which is a really great relief for anybody, being in the development team. Uh, yeah, important part is that you prepare the system for production in advance. And I would say that probably the largest part here is that your change management is really, really easy. So in many cases, what happens with, change management? So for example, you have a different model doing, something, right? You want to change this model. So you need to change the model files, you need to change the signatures of the functions, you need to change how they call and so on and so forth. So from the time that you develop the model until the release, like it was like 2 months already, and you don't really know whether you captured like all the details of how to use this model. And when you really release it, you don't really know what happened. So it happens all the time in complex systems. So having a switch like this system or that system, and you have all the kind of quality measurements for both of them. So you really need what's inside and how it works. And you just say, all right, now every traffic, like every request goes there, and that's it. That's all your change management. It's super, super easy.
You know what strikes me here is that first, this is very similar to what Agile Manifesto
Mm,
wanted us. So like they wanted us to be to work in such small increments as possible to get faster feedback. This is hard. Decom like making features smaller to work on them is hard, but then you get used to it, and then it's easier. Because if you plan your changes or your features in smaller chunks, yes, you have to think about infrastructure. Yes, you have to make changes to infrastructure to support those type of small releases. But then you're much safer because if we compare a 1 year release to 1 week release, it's just much safer to do one week release. And also, this is very interesting here. Like in testing, there is a constant struggle to make test data as close to production data as possible, and yet not to reveal all the information from production databases in a test database. But then here, you don't have a test database. You
yeah.
plan everything according to the production database. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and this also, put some limits to this, obviously,
Yeah.
because yeah, and yeah, regarding the, agile, I would say that this is probably as far as it gets because you really need to construct the whole system, before
Yes.
putting it to the test. So
Mm-hmm.
again, this is definitely a limitation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I just wanted to share a few things where I think it worked like super, super well for us.
Mm-hmm.
And you might think, like you need to create a whole new system, probably duplicate an infrastructure and everything like that. So probably it's like very, very complex. However, in many cases, it's not really complex. So one
Mm-hmm.
example I will give you. You have all these kind of smart things going on, working or whatever. Imagine you just need to change like LLM version, in the baseline. So
Uh-huh.
what you do, you just duplicate all the requests or like high level sort of setup, launch this with this model, launch this with that model, and just log,
Yeah.
both results and then just check how it works.
Mm-hmm.
As easy as it gets, I think I made like hundreds of such, changes in the last years. And
Mm-hmm.
every time you have the diff, based on user inputs, not something very, very, I would say, like, synthetic in this
Mm-hmm.
regard. And yeah, you can just see, the timings, you can see the errors, you can see everything. So in many
Mm-hmm.
cases, it's easier than you can think because, again, like, the question always is that how complex is the system? Because in many cases, it would be not so complex,
Mm-hmm.
so we can do it easily.
But
In
when
some
you're
cases,
talking about changing LLMs, it would be very hard for you to replicate the type of load that you have on a live production server when you're experimenting with a new version of an LLM. You would have to redo similar requests to an LLM. In this scenario, when you're just routing the traffic but not hitting the users, not impacting the users, you see the exact type of load that
yeah.
users make on an LLM on prod to your new LLM version.
Yeah. So you can think about it as a limitation, right? So you need all
Hmm.
to kind of cover all the infrastructure needs and so on.
Yeah.
But you also can think about it as a benefit because,
Hmm.
if it's running in production, it's like 7 days and you have no problems, no
Hmm.
degradation, nothing, then probably it's ready for production. Again,
Yeah.
multiple times I had these examples where people are doing their, load testing and everything seems fine, but then it goes into production and everything breaks because again, you can't really,
Something. Yeah.
you can't really model everything perfectly, and then you
Yeah.
don't know where it kind of breaks. So
Mm-hmm.
again, I will give you a few examples from our like recent like month or whatever. So for example, we have a number of caching levels in the
Mm-hmm.
application, right? So for example, user is requesting a program, which is a number of products with some, text about each product, with some like evaluations of each product and so on. It might be the case that we already know the program for the user, so we just take it as it is and just display it, right? That's kind of level number one. If we don't know the program, or for example, something changed in the profile, user made some changes, or maybe they just, uh, going into onboarding of the app, then probably we need to create it, right? So we go to some recommendation pool, I would say, of the products, and we need to calculate a little bit of a stuff for this user. But then again, for each calculation, we actually know the scores for like similar user profiles for the same products. So we don't
Mm-hmm.
really need to calculate everything. So, we have this again, the caching level for known scores for known products for known users for known, I would
Mm-hmm.
say, like user profiles. And then if you don't fall here, we fall into calculation of, like fit scores and stuff. So we need to calculate the features, and then we need to calculate like the GPT style,
Right.
anyway, like LLM type of stuff. So we have the cache here as well. So for example, I have like oily skin and let's say acne, So for
Mm-hmm.
some prompts, I will just need to know that I have oily skin, and for other prompts, I would need just to know that I have acne. And
Mm-hmm.
somebody before me already came, and they have the same prompt, so we can reduce it
Yeah.
as a result. So we have a lot of, these kind of levels. And when we make a change, basically all of these levels are invalidated, right? So again, this is an example where we, if we just launch everything into the production, it just breaks because we have like a crap ton of load on the LLMs. For everybody, everything just doesn't work. It
Mm-hmm.
requires a lot of time to really load stuff and so on. So we don't really work when the caches are not populated.
Yeah.
So as an example for Google payments and here as well, we need some time to kind of process all of that to populate the caches and see how it goes. So for example, that's how we sort of measure that, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we had a certain release, doesn't really matter like what it is, right? So anyway, around here, like 1 p.m. whatever, we invalidated the cache.
Yeah.
As you can see before that, it was almost all requests was like 100% cache hit, basically. So
Mm-hmm.
this is the chart for cache hits.
Mm-hmm.
And then, there's just probabilistic rule, right? Like, you will have almost everything covered, like in the first like minutes, hours, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't really see a hard drop here, right? So for like a minute, it was like 0%, and the next minute it was already like 20%, and like in
Mm-hmm.
5 minutes it was already like 80%. So then we can see
The
the
growth.
saturation over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it grows. So you like wait for like a day or maybe a few days, and you see that like currently you're hitting the cache like quite frequently, so you can just launch it, but
Mm-hmm.
not before that. And
Mm-hmm.
also what you have during this time, you have this traffic going on. You can again
Right.
look for bugs. You can check the quality. So that's kind of cool.
So
And
you're hot loading, like preparing, warming up your car to
yeah.
drive.
Exactly. Yeah, that's just a warm-up type. Again, in this case, for example, we had again some launch, so that was completely new. So we
Mm-hmm.
didn't have anything prior to that. So in this case, it was somewhat slow
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the situation. But anyway, you can see that like in like one day it was already like more than 90%. So you can imagine that this kind of periods where it's almost 100%, it would be much more frequent. So
Yeah.
then we look at, let's say, latency, right? Again, when we launch it, we don't have pretty much
Mm-hmm.
cache hits altogether. So like 99% like 5 seconds or whatever, and then it goes down. Median goes to zero, then 95% goes to zero, then 99% goes to zero.
Yeah.
And then at this point we can say, all right, now we can easily launch it because we don't have any issues. Everybody
Yeah.
will
Good
see
to
the results
go.
quite, yeah. So this is also an example where in my mind, it works pretty well. When you have
Mm-hmm.
some type of preparation, and in many cases you have some type of preparation,
Yeah.
and you have all the other benefits as well. So
Mm-hmm.
this is basically the use case for this type of testing in my mind. And again, for like quality changes, I would say that this is very, very basic. And I would say that you can even say that you have that each time you basically launch an A/B test, right?
Yeah.
And again, I would say in web search, for example, specifically, what we did, we struggled a lot with the change management as well, because again, like you have a new recommendation engine, and you need to launch it, but then you need to, do something with profile, something with features, something with everything, and you
Hmm.
can't really keep track of all of it, and you launch it and you don't really see the result that you saw in the experiment. So what we did is
Hmm.
basically there's like some sort of a flag which is enabled on, let's say, balancer level, which enables certain logic, and then the change is basically turning this flag on. So
Hmm.
when you go into release, you just turn it by default, and that's the only piece of change manager that you have. So it worked really,
Yeah.
really well. And in this case, I think that for us, it's basically the same concept, just different sort of instruments around it.
Yeah, so for me, the key things here in dark launch testing is that first you have an opportunity to have proper warm up and proper
Yeah,
testing of things which require accumulation of data, such as like, for example, in banking, you have to close the day at the end of the day.
yeah,
So you have to have the data for the day at least to be able to verify that the closing day procedure actually works. There is no risk because your users do not see what new code is doing.
yep,
You run it somewhere else. And there is, to me, there is a very important thing that you said changing your infrastructure and your approach to release is hard. I do agree, and yet I believe that this is a good change because it makes you think how you design your system in such a way that it is testable. Because if your system is not testable, you cannot say that, you cannot guarantee or ensure or even confidently say that your system does what it is intended to do. So this is very, very important. And I believe that you can even try significant changes. As you said, with LLM's versions, the changes are completely unpredictable sometimes. Like I've seen in my little experience with ChatGPT of different versions, sometimes the new version is not giving me the better results.
yep, yep.
And this is completely unpredictable. Like I'm expecting better results and I'm getting worse results. So if I was providing users some logics, some product with the use of LLM, I would require myself to actually wrap it in such a way similar to dark launch.
Yeah, and 2 points from me here is that, like, I believe that very, very important part is just the, like, l- just psychological ease of making changes, that
Mm-hmm.
you really know that, yeah, it serves real traffic, you really
Mm-hmm.
understand that everything like for real, but still you are not pressured, for it to really
Yeah.
work.
So
Yeah,
no
so
fingers crossing for the release. You just release it.
yeah, and you can work, you can push commits, you can do stuff, and you
Mm-hmm.
don't, need to like 24/7 look at what happens and whatnot. So that's
Mm-hmm.
one part. And I would say that in development it's really, really important, especially in, research, because the more you sort of uncertain as to what happens, the more, the less effort you can put into real research.
The
So that's
less
one part.
value of the research as well, because if your research demands new data from the users but you're not sure what's going on there, like
Yeah,
A/B
yeah,
testing
yeah.
won't work, or any research won't work.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and the ease of change management, because we know that, most of the outages happen with changes.
Yeah.
So when you change, like, change this system and then this system and then these signatures and then, like release all this kinds of stuff. Whereas here you just have, a single switch saying that like this traffic goes there.
Yeah.
Uh, and also during this change, you also sort of psychologically safe, because this already was in production, you know all the timings, all the errors. So you
Yeah.
basically know what you're launching. It's not like, you launch a new version and you're like, oh, what would happen? I have no clue. So that's not really funny. Yeah, and I saw a lot of people struggling with that because, uncertainty really brings a lot of, you know,
Yeah.
stress,
I,
and it's not really good thing
I
to.
remember my first deployment, it was 2007, and I was uploading files via FTP. And
Oh,
I was finger crossed. I had my fingers crossed that the internet connection doesn't die during the upload, because then everything would just die. That was fun.
yeah, yeah.
What a long path we had. What a long road we covered. Nice.
Yeah, it's hard to believe how we did releases back then. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. It was like,
yeah.
for me, it was a revelation that on Nginx, it was a matter of just changing the config to point to another directory with a different
Yeah,
git
and this is
branch.
exactly what we try to reproduce here. Yeah, yeah. It
Yes,
just,
yeah,
it's not always like Nginx or whatever, but
yeah.
yeah, but the point is that, yeah, we just redirected and sort of, yeah. So those are kind of things I would say
Mm-hmm,
that definitely there's more, but I would say that for these three sort of approaches, I would say
mm-hmm,
that whenever I think about, some problem that I see in any kind of system, I see at least some place for all of them to be useful
mm-hmm,
in one way or another. And obviously, I see a very large possibility of using them specifically for research projects because they have like, all of these kinds of uncertainties. I would say that things like unit testing and like regular functional testing are basically useless there because really unpredictable outputs, you always need to sort of measure quality in one way or another. Yeah, and you really need to be super close to the user to really replicate what happens. So in such research heavy projects, I would say that like regular approaches just don't work all too well. So in one way or another, you're kind of forced to use one of that or just, or just always, you know,
Oh, hope for the
like,
better.
yeah. So yeah, just I would say that consider that. Uh, Probably nothing worse, would happen anyway if you have something on top of that. And yeah, probably some really nice insight might come as well from all this kind of testing. So yeah, thank you.
I loved it. I loved both dark launches and shell level testing and crowdsource testing. I am quite inspired to try them out. So thank you so much. And let's hope our audience will be inspired too.
Yeah,
Thank you,
hope
Alexei.
hope that, and yeah, share your experience if you try something of that.
Yep.
Hopefully, we'll get to better future with all that.
And Alexei is always open for feedback on LinkedIn and for questions too. So don't hesitate to contact him.
Absolutely, and we definitely will cover some of this in like separate posts, so you will have
Yes.
the ability to comment on something very specific. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And have a lovely day.
Yes. And see
Thank you.
you then. Bye bye.
Yes. Thank you. Bye.